Welcome to Advanced Lightroom. This is video 1, which is where to start. Now, this is a Lightroom library of mine from last week on the Isle of Skye. I haven't deleted any images, I've just left it as it is, and I've left it this way in particular so that you can see not only the ones that I'm going to work, but the ones I'm not going to work. And it allows us to start this process by selecting good candidates, making that decision in which images are the ones that we're going to work, because not all the images that you take are going to work, and not all the images that you take are going to be worth working. So there is going to be some culling, and there is going to be some decision making, and part of that decision making process is to decide which ones we want to work on. So let's just dive straight in here. I am going to look at a short little series here, and this was the first one I've taken. Now, this was taken with a 10 stop ND on it, and sometimes either looking through the preview screen with the aperture wide open, you can sometimes see exactly what's going on. Obviously, looking through the viewfinder, you see nothing because it's got a 10 stopper in the front of it. So sometimes composition can be a little bit tricky, and it takes a couple of images to dial it in and nail it into exactly where you want it to be. So this is the first image, and as you can see, this peak in the top here is a bit too close to the edge, and the river's skewed off there. The second one I've corrected a little bit better, and then the third one I've started to dial in a composition that I'm much happier with. And I feel now that the balance of the elements, so this bright line in the foreground, the distinctive shaped peak, we have a clear source of light coming in from the top right hand corner, which we can filter down across the river here. This strikes me as an ideal candidate, so I'm going to set the flag to flagged, and then we can come back to that one a little bit later. Other images, again, this is a good example here. We have a big snow shower was coming through, and I'd found this composition that I really liked. I mean, these boulders are really distinctive in the foreground, and they lead perfectly through the frame to, again, the distinctive shape of Marsco at the back here of Glen Sligachen. Now, I noticed over my shoulder there was a big snow shower coming through, and as it came through, it started to obliterate the mountain, and then just as quickly again it started to clear. So I have a series of a few images here where we go from having partially obscured peak, totally obscured peak, to visible peak again. And as the light was changing, I hadn't actually made any real adjustments. Again, I was using the 10 stopper because I wanted totally silky water, because otherwise you end up with a really cluttered water situation, which doesn't particularly contrast well with the mountains that I was wanting to create. So again, we've got 3 images here which are really different in nature, with different tonalities, different color palettes. In the end, this was the one I decided I wanted to work. So again, I've set it as flagged, so we'll come back to that one later, partially because of the obscured peak. So in terms of making choices of which images you're going to process, everything has to be composition driven at this stage. We're talking about the subjects, the flow, the emotion that you've captured in the image, the mood of the image as it stands, and we're looking for contrasts. So if we go back to this example here, we're looking at contrast between bright areas and dark areas, bright areas and dark areas, areas of high contrast to areas of low contrast. So the water here is low contrast, but this boulder is potentially very high contrast. The sky here, we can add contrast into this area to make it much more dramatic. So contrast drives every decision that we're going to make. If I just snap open another image here, contrasts where we have sharp defined foreground subjects, dark midground, a dark midground, and then this distinctive triangular peak in the distance. We have color contrast between the very warm sky and the cooler areas of the river. These are all things that we can accentuate through our processing. So the decision-making process is very much to do with finding images that are going to work in terms of contrasts, flow, ones that you can put mood into. Here's another example. this is already massively contrasty. We've got deep shadows, we've got foreground rocks, we've got this incredible light spilling in from the sunset on the right hand side, dramatic shaped mountains, nice amount of negative space that we can counterpoint all this against as well. This is an absolute cert for one that I would want to work in the future as something that's going to be a really dramatic image. So the choice of our images has to be driven by content, because it's the content that you took in the field at the time that is basically setting you up for everything you do in processing. So in the second part, I want to move through into looking at what we can get out of these files and letting the file determine. Welcome to part 2, Unleashing the Possibilities. Now, once we've gone through and flagged a number of images, we have flagged them for a choice. We've flagged them because they're basically what we're going to call our keepers. Now, this isn't all of the images that I like from my shoot over the last week, but it will do for demonstrating everything that we need to demonstrate here. Now, the first thing you are going to realize is that my images do not come out of the camera looking like this. Most raw files come out the camera looking like this, which is a much flatter, less saturated, more washed out type of presentation than you see in the preview screen at the back of your camera. The preview you see is the JPEG preview, which is made up of all the settings that you have in your camera for sharpness, saturation, contrast, etc. And what I do is I always import my images with the import punch plugin, preset that we gave away with Lightroom Essentials. And the reason for that is that I end up with an image in Lightroom that looks a little bit more like the image that I got in camera. And I personally find it an awful lot easier to deal with. Otherwise, you have to use your imagination an awful lot more to really see what is going to be in a file. So where to start? Now, I think the first thing to really look at in terms of unleashing the possibilities is to understand the whole process of taking ownership. From this moment on, you are in the driving seat. You're the person who's going to make creative decisions in terms of how these images are going to turn out. Over the last decade or so, I've developed my own style, and I tend to produce images that look a certain way because that is the way that I personally like to do it. It doesn't mean they're better or worse than anybody else's. It's just the way I see it in my mind when I'm in the field and when I'm in front of the computer. So I think the first thing to realize is, let's look at this example and let's reset it in the develop module back to where it was. So this is it straight out the camera. Had I used the import punch preset, we already see it's more contrasty, a little bit more vibrant. I've added these adjustments, but let's take it back to ground zero and say this is how it's come out of the camera as a flat raw file. Now, I know when I was there that the light was incredible, but because I've exposed this image to the right, the whole thing is pretty washed out. And there are two very quick ways that you can demonstrate to yourself what the potential is in this image. The first is with the exposure slider. With it at 0, if we drag it to the right, what we're going to do is saturate some of these colors that are already in the image, because brightness is directly related to saturation. The darker something is, the more saturated it is, the brighter it is, the more washed out it is. So we can see already that there's quite a lot of color locked up in this image. The contrast needs to be sorted out, but there is definitely color in that sky, and also in little touches here and there. And you can see the blue in the shadows because the camera has to take a white balance preset from its memory banks and give the overall image a white balance. So it means if this is going to be warm, this is going to be cool by comparison. exploiting those differences to have the image look the way we want it to look. The second great tool that we have at our disposal is our white balance picker, and we can decide what we want to be neutral. So obviously if you click on a warm area, it's going to cool it down and green it up, and if we click on a cooler area, the overall image is going to get warmer. Now this obviously is a sunrise image, and by nature it would make sense for it to be warmer. So I'm going to show you a quick tool that really helps to pop some of those colors. I'm just going to bring the brightness up a little bit so we can see what we're doing, because it was a little bit dark at the moment. And what I'm going to talk about here is the camera calibration area. If we use the blue slider and bring it to the right, you can see how it's punched the reds. It's acted as a luminosity slider for the reds, but instead of targeting the reds, it's actually targeting the whole image, so it's a global correction. And if we then use the saturation slider to boost the reds, you can see how bright we've made those reds, and we can change the hue to make them a little bit more magenta or a little bit more yellow, and there is something that I think is pretty natural looking. So just that little quick adjustment between our temperature, our exposure, and our camera calibration, if we look at what we imported from the camera to what we have now, we have a very different looking image. One of the first things we need to start thinking about is the overall look and feel of the image. Do we want this to be a bright image, a dark image, a high contrast image, a low contrast image? Do we want it to be cool, or do we want it to be warm? And this is the first decision that we really have to make. It can be very useful if you're going to end up with a high contrasty image. It can be a good idea to start off with something that's darker and then add light to the areas that you want to accentuate. So if we wanted to brighten up this waterfall and then lead the eye through to the peak and then make the sky a bit more dramatic still, these are all things that we can do using local adjustments, which we'll come on to a little bit later. If we go back to another example, let's look at this one, because I think this is another good example. This blue was quite natural. We were seeing a lot of blue in the shadows, and it was so distinctive that that is something that I would like to retain and preserve. The overall feel of this image is actually very close to how it was when we were there. It's something that's been rendered quite accurately. Let's make a few adjustments to this image. I hate this top corner. The way that little triangle is visible, I really dislike. So I'm going to get rid of it and just get rid of it straight away. I'm not going to bother about sensor spots and stuff like that at the moment. Let's add contrast to this image. Now, the import punch has a tiny little S curve in it. Let's get rid of that, and let's use our sliders to create our black and white points. We actually cover this in Essential Lightroom, but it's something we need to do here. And I'm going to go all the way to produce black and white points, and then with snow you want to bring your highlights right down, because then that's creating as much contrast in here as possible. If your highlights are bright, you actually lose contrast in your snow. So I tend to bring them down a wee bit, and then you need to reset your white point a little bit more. So then you end up with really textured snow, and you can see how much texture were brought out in this image straight away just by that really simple adjustment. Now, in terms of the color, again, we use our two sliders. The one I've already darkened this one by half a stop with import punch. Let's darken it a little bit more and then reset our white point accordingly. So that's what that's doing, is darkening the midtones. The exposure slider focuses on midtones all the time. And then let's use our color picker to see what is the overall feel of this image. Now it's making the snow a little yellow for my taste. And obviously if we get rid of that blue cast, it obviously makes the image very warm. That's not too bad. It's a little flat for me. I'd like to retain a little bit of that warmth. And again, I'm going to go down to the camera calibration tool to really bring out those sunset colors in the sky. And it's producing a very nice overall feel. And that is something I'm happy with. I think the blue has been retained, the brightness of the sunset has been retained, and the snow is essentially neutral, but we've brought out the contrast necessary to accentuate that leading line from the crack to the boulder to the cracks in the ice. And that has given us something from which we imported, which has this lavender cast to it, which cameras do, especially with 10 stoppers on, to something that's very neutral and still gives an impression of a sunset and an evening look. Finally, let's just visit one more example of that, and let's go to one of these sunset images here. In fact, no, let's go to this. Let's just use this one. This is one where it was taken a little bit later in the morning, and the light had definitely started to tail off. Now, there are situations in landscape photography where it is entirely possible for you to create a look and feel that perhaps wasn't entirely accurate as to how you experienced it. And I think the word I'm going to use here is faking it. We can make this cool and dramatic. So this is, there's your cool frosty morning with lots of snow and ice. Or equally, we can make it tinted so that it has a look of much warmer light. Now, in terms of which one of these is accurate, I don't believe the word accuracy has anything to do with this. It was sunrise, it was still the morning, the light was warm. In the winter, the sun is very low on the horizon. There's nothing to say that this isn't actually accurate, as long as you can make it believable. And again, if we look at what we imported from our camera and what we are going to start working on for our image, we can make creative decisions to have images that are warm, rich in detail, or cool and contrasty. Anything. We have no limits. One tip of a slider and we go from cool and quite tranquil to potentially warm and fiery, and we can exaggerate that light even further using local adjustments. So the point of this unleashing the possibilities part of the video is realizing that raw files are capturing a massive amount of data. They are capturing a lot of possibilities, and there are things hidden in your raw files that you do not know exists. And it's very important, as the very first stage of your processing, to look at these images and say, what color is hidden in this raw file? What contrast is hidden in this? If we look at these shadow details, for example, if we zoom in here and just open up our shadows, how much shadow detail is hidden in that image? So we have an option with these sliders to produce images exactly how we want them to be. And in the next part of the video, we'll start looking at some of these images and show exactly how we are going to bring depth and contrast and visual interest into these images. So that's it for now. We'll see you in the next part.